again, and welcome to another installment of the Opera Huntsville Bluebeard's Castle podcast series. My name is Shannon Rose McAuliffe, and I'm excited to talk to you today about some of the psychological elements in this exciting piece by Bela Bartok. We've got a bunch of other podcast and video material. It covers topics like the original source material, which is an old fairy tale, some of the influences of this story. We talk about the history of the composer, the opera itself, and today's conversation, as I referenced before, will be a conversation about how artists and creators approach the psychological elements that make this piece so compelling. I'm joined today by a dear friend and colleague, Peter Tucker. He's a really creative, phenomenal visual artist, but I'm going to let you do a quick self-intro. Hi, Peter.
Hi, Shannon Rose. How you doing?
I'm doing really well. I'm excited to talk about this with you. Tell our fun listeners who you are.
I am a traditional artist and software developer and all-around tech nerd, and I love painting and I love doing illustration and all sorts of fun stuff.
Well, I'm really excited for us to talk about this today. I'm coming at this from the perspective of the performing arts. You're
Yes.
coming at this from the perspective of the visual arts, but we're going to talk about the sort of confluence of all of that and how that, the common themes, the differences that go into how different kinds of creatives...
The Venn diagram of...
of how creators approach, interpreting something, especially as juicy as this story is. So... Firstly, I guess I'll start. I have a background as an opera singer and a music historian. So I love to perform and be on the stage, but I love to be a nerd and I love to combine all of that wherever possible. But from the strictly performance side of the perspective, part of my job is to inhabit the character and, leave my personal stuff at the stage door and create a whole new person. So... there are some kind of crazy things that will go into that. You've heard of people doing method acting, really trying to create a new persona and inhabit this role. And in the case of something that can be so subjective, like Bluebeard's Castle, I could come up with a character and a concept and a motivation for Judith. It's my responsibility to convey that. The director may or may not get on board with that. The person singing Bluebeard might have an entirely different idea. So it's a really interesting collaborative process. But while you're considering your own attachment to the piece, it's also important to note that your own interpretation can change over time based on your own life experiences. But something that I have found particularly interesting is that you and I have both gotten tied into this performance, but we're also creating our own performance of this next year.
Yeah.
So, it's not a super frequently performed piece, but we've both done an awful lot of work on it. And it's been interesting just to juxtapose through different productions, different collaborations. You're probably never going to get the same interpretation twice.
Yeah.
So I would love to hear about some of your own creative process as you've thought about how you'll convey this to people who might be unfamiliar and how you apply it to your own work.
Yeah, well, I think when we first got together and first started working on Bluebeard, I'm a book buff, a horror buff. I take concepts and interpretations from all sorts of media, and I think one of our early conversations was I was telling you that I was a big fan of House of Leaves and how strange a book that is. It's about a family that moves into a house and it's larger on the inside than it is on the outside. Just think about that for a moment.
It's a lot. It's heady.
Yeah, and
no pun intended.
It has growing hallways and closets that go to nowhere, or closets that go into giant caves and spiral staircases, and this family has to deal with this dynamic of a constantly shaping house, but it's ultimately my interpretation is a metaphor for the mind, and Bluebeard is very similar in that you have Judith exploring the mind of Bluebeard in all his rooms in his castles, and we kind of I instantly fell in love with Bluebeard.
And I think that was sort of a really good jumping off point, and we started to see all these influences in other places. And I know that you also were talking a lot about The Shining and how that was a really big source of inspiration for different ways of thinking about it through the characters, through their, mental states, who's really living the story. So, like, what's the Shining connection for you?
So I've been like I said, I'm a huge horror fan, and probably out of all the horror I've watched, Shining would have to be number one. I saw it when I was very young. It scarred me for life and made me a forever fan of The Shining.
I love that.
Kubrick.
This is like the behind the scenes dive into like what makes a tortured artist.
Right. So if we really go into it, we're going to be here for hours. But to give you a summary of why I love The Shining, it's just so weird and so can be interpreted in so many different ways. And it's for instance, like with Jack Nicholson's character, Jack Torrance, when they're first driving up to the Overlook Hotel, it's really strange because he's talking to Shelley Duvall's character, Wendy, and his son about cannibalism. And it's just Kubrick starts out the whole movie kind of unhinged, kind of weird. There's something weird going on there.
I'm giving you my best Kubrick stare
yes.
right now. For those who can't see it, I'm giving him really creepy eyes as he says this.
It's very well done.
Oh,
I like
thanks.
it. Nailed it.
Also, on the topic of cannibalism, it occurs to me that Charles Dickens has a short story that ties into Bluebeard and involves cannibalism, but even to tie back to a minute ago, he was told this story by his nanny in youth, and apparently it scarred him for life. Okay. So, here's that overlapping, I guess, cannibalism and childhood trauma.
Yeah. Leads to good art?
Leads to genius.
Yeah.
Sorry, that Dickens thing just occurred to me because I've been doing a pretty deep dive into some of the other sort of derivative works. But you were saying...
Oh, yeah. So, The Shining is weird from the start. And it gets kind of weird in a meta manner where, Jack Nicholson's name and Jack Torrance's name, they're both named Jack, and that's strange. And, it goes like, does all work and no play make Jack Nicholson a dull boy? It just gets weird in there that they're both named Jack. And I think probably that was done intentionally by Kubrick. That was something that he would probably come up with. But like the thing that originally connected The Shining to our version of Bluebeard is thinking that there's an interpretation where The Shining might possibly be in Wendy's head. Mm-hmm. And then I was thinking, wow, it would be cool to do a version where Bluebeard is in Judith's head. Like,
oh, absolutely. I think a lot of people tend to focus on what's going on with Bluebeard. Is he terribly vulnerable? Is he not letting Judith in? But what if you flip that narrative? Right. What if it's the Judith show?
Right. Is the castle like a physical place, or is it like House of Leaves, like their rooms in somebody's head that she's exploring? Mm-hmm. She's exploring her own anxieties and fears and whatever that could be.
So there are obviously a lot of different ways to unpack and sort through and make interpretive choices and, sort of pick apart nuances about this. What are some other ones that occur to you?
I mean, you could go with like Judith actually being in a castle and exploring these actual rooms, and there's horrors inside.
Very realistic.
Yeah. But there's also the psychological interpretation of Judith going inside Bluebeard's mind. We've come up and thought with other versions where maybe Bluebeard doesn't exist. Maybe it's Judith like thinking about a potential partner and the horrors of dating, and you could go vice versa with Bluebeard. There's just so many different.
And, I think that's true because we all have a lot of anxieties in our own lives, like when we're interacting with new people, stranger danger. And this could definitely be an interpretation of the story. From the outset, so much of the focus is on Bluebeard and on his castle.
Right.
We get very little sort of exposition or background on Judith. She basically just sort of says, "Here we are. I've never even been to your house. I just left the guy I was supposed to marry. I left my family. I'm here with you now."
And it's a really weird opening, too.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, what is going on? You've just been thrown into this situation. Which is...
Maybe Judith has also just been thrown into the situation.
That's right. Yeah.
So as much as we've been talking about our own interpretations and deep dives, which I also encourage everyone listening to do their own version of this as they get more acquainted with the story, this doesn't just exist like up for a personal sort of choose your own adventure sort of method of thinking of it. This also has a lot of resonances within clinical psychology and established schools of thought. Something that comes to mind is Carl Jung. So for people who might not be familiar, he is sometimes referenced as the father of analytical psychology. It's most often associated with a focus on dreams and the subconscious. So his methodologies tend to be applied quite frequently to literary and anthropological settings and like a whole host of other ones. So I think there are applications here. What are your thoughts?
like archetypes, for example, and probably the ones that would have the most influence on Bluebeard would be like the concept of anima and animus. These
What does that mean?
Female forces and male forces within all of us, and they're kind of like personified. You could go into like chaos and order, or empathy and stoicism. It's just these internal forces that
polarities, things that could be at odds with each other,
that like manifest in so many of our everyday interactions in life. And those that type of thought process definitely like came through with our thinking, making our production, the art stuff. I know on my own we were talking about feminine qualities, like we were talking about painting flowers in the poster and what that could represent.
So there's a room, number 4. What's behind door number 4? It's a secret garden.
Yeah.
And what we were thinking about is all of the sort of sideline adventures and representations in psychology you could go off on, because some flowers represent friendship, some of them represent love. There are flowers that represent hospitality, which is kind of funky when you think about the fact that Bluebeard is essentially Judith's host in this situation. But, as we process through how we're going to represent this, it's also worth mentioning, I think, that some of this can just exist for us in the context of our production. There are going to be all sorts of other elements and interpretive choices in this Huntsville production.
Right.
And some of it can be pretty overt. Some of it could be sort of subliminal but
nuance,
explained to the audience. And other pieces of it could just exist, sort of for the people involved. It doesn't always need to be said. It could just sort of be some special internal interpretive thing. So there's a whole range in how you can dive into this and share and represent. And as I was saying earlier, when you're choosing to build a character and to inhabit another being or another persona, that's going to vary, production by production. And it sounds like there are a whole host of other ways to apply even established schools of thought and interpretation onto a story like this one.
Yeah, it's interesting listening to what you were talking about of putting yourself in the character, like even from the visual sense and working on the poster design that we were doing. Like, it was Bluebeard's weird to begin with, and when you when you paint something, you put so much time and so much of yourself into a painting. It's a therapy session on its own. I discussed with you how when I was working on the poster, it got very weird. Is I would start working on the painting and I spent hours and hours and hours working on a different model, and then looking at it like a day later, it's like, oh my God, I painted myself as Bluebeard. Like, what is going on? Paint over, then do it again. Just kind of, it's just so weird to be.
I think it's had a lot of different iterations now, hasn't it? Like,
yes,
and some of them will now be lost to the sands of time because
I recorded them.
So that's right. You have a time lapse going. But,
I do.
It's interesting, having to be flexible and invest yourself in it is probably a big challenge because so much of this is personal.
Yeah.
But when you have to share it with somebody else, you can't impose your own stuff on them, which is sort of maybe even sort of symbolic of how it is to exist in the world with other human beings.
Yeah. Yeah. You could definitely interpret it that way. I think with any sort of art, like, you have to kind of walk that edge of like it being all about the artist versus it just being all about the subject matter. You definitely have to bring yourself to whatever piece of art you're doing, and it's if you're not aware of it, you can paint yourself several times into a poster.
The other thing is, what you just said raises something in my head. You've got to put yourself into it or be aware of how you're putting yourself into it. It strikes me that that's got to be the same for the audience. So, we started the conversation by saying that, there are all sorts of elements that you have to consider, but everything that we just talked about, even though it fits into some of our own interpretations, and it could fit into some of these sort of clinical boxes, so much of this transcends that. This isn't just diagnostic, and we're not here to tell anybody how to think about this. So something that I'd be really interested in as a pivot, dear listeners, after this conversation, what do you think are some of the most relevant aspects of the story that are relatable to you, to all of us? Maybe you see elements of the story in your own lives, in your own relationships. To that end, we would be very interested in hearing your own questions, your reflections. Shoot us an email or hit us up on our social media channels, because after the production, we are going to be having a panel discussion, another podcast with members of the Opera Huntsville team who have contributed to this production and to this sort of educational behind-the-scenes podcast series. So if you would like us to hit on a topic, discuss some of your thoughts, your feedback about the production, any resonances or highlights for you, we would really love to hear about it. So let us know. Email us, info@operahuntsville.org. Find us on social media. All of the information for contacting us is on the website. But this all doesn't exist in a vacuum, and we want to hear more. There is a dynamic. We don't just want to give you things. We want to hear from you too. That'll help to shape how we continue to create our own art, right?
If I could just interject thing,
yeah,
I think
please.
That's one of the core things about art that makes it so much fun and engaging is discussing, exchanging ideas, that it's not this thing on its own. Like if you're to interpret, you become almost the author of it in a way, even though you might not be the original playwright or painter, but you become an author with this thing. So I say get out there, interact with as much art as you possibly can.
Yeah, and talk about it with other people as much as you possibly can. That's how this relationship was forged. So
that's right.
Keep doing it. Keep thinking about it. Keep coming to art. And that's a perfect seg into a shameless plug. Buy your tickets. Come to Bluebeard's Castle. It will be playing this coming weekend, October 28th through 30th at the VBC Playhouse in Huntsville. You can get tickets and more information on the site. There are more podcasts and an informational video that cover, the psychology, the drama, the music, the fairy tale itself. So definitely check out all of those resources. And also, thank you so much, Peter, for joining. It was really wonderful to have you.
Always an awesome discussion with you, Shayra.
I absolutely love that. And everybody should check out Peter's art at peterctucker.art. You can see some of the amazing things that Peter has been up to. His talent blows my mind continually, and it's always a delight to sit here and pick each other's brains about art. So thank you for that, and thank you everybody for listening. Hope to see you this weekend, and remember, send us your questions. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks so much.
Thank you.